Okay, so now we're gonna talk about mixing and completing your EP. I'm sure some of you, this may be an element that you're the most curious about, and I thank you for your almost 6 hours of patience. Um, I'm not sure how much longer this will take, but we're not going to quit until it's done. And so let's just get into it. All right, mixing. We're gonna say it's six simple steps, and I'm gonna sort of break it down for you. Sort of thought about this and sort of just kind of break it down in an approach that you can take and build from. Obviously, mixing can be hugely complicated, the same as any one step of this process. But kind of want to distilling it down into 6 steps so that you can have something to digest and grow from. So create a balance between your instruments. This is like when we're gonna start our mix from scratch. Okay. Now, if you'll do what I ask you to do and encourage you to do is make rough mixes along the way, you're kind of already got a jump start on this first bullet point here of balance all your different tracks in your static mix first. Now, what I mean by static mix is that you just establish a balance of all of your instruments, and none of the faders, none of the volumes are changing. It's not really a mix yet. It's a balance. Okay, so static mix, balance all of your instruments, or all your tracks. It's not just instruments; it's voices too, perhaps. So start there. And if you've been making rough mixes along the way, then you maybe already have something that you've established. Maybe you want to just start over and you just turn it all down, mute it, and start fresh. And that's okay too, because if you've been making rough mixes along the way, you have a feel for where you're going and what you want to do. And making a new static mix from nothing might give you a little fresh perspective. So anyways, this is where we're starting. And by static mix, I mean just balance all of your stuff where everything can be heard throughout the structure of the song, and that all the arranged parts kind of come in at sort of appropriate volumes. Not necessarily the final volumes, but they're beginning to find their place. It can make sense as a start of a mix. It's a balance. You should be able to play the song from the top to bottom and hear things in the place they should be. And this is where we're kind of trying to start to establish where we're panning things, and what's important, where our contrast is, what's loud, what's quiet, what's left, what's right. And just use the volume, your faders, your volume adjustment to make your static balance. Have everything sitting in a good place before putting on any effects. Now, what I mean really is that before you add more effects, we've already sort of said that you probably have like a general reverb. You've got some stuff on the vocal. You don't necessarily have to kill that stuff and make a balance. If you've had it going in your rough mix, keep it, and we're going to add to it. But keep those things in there. A lot of times when I'm working on a record, we will have a lower latency reverb, very simple non-processor hog reverb in there, just to kind of be our general reverb. And not weigh down the processor too much, the computer, not introduce too much latency into the delay compensation in the session. You have to learn to manage these different things. So let's get the static balance. Let's use whatever existing effects you have in there, and kind of get our bass line established. So the song kind of sounds like the song. You can generally hear all the parts. Once you do that, then the next step is pretty critical, because This is sort of like the pipeline and the conduit and the sort of the final shape and glue that you're going to give this balance you have as your starting mix. Create a master fader. I call it a master fader because that's what it is in Pro Tools. I use Pro Tools predominantly, but there are, I know in Logic there's group faders. Like that groups of instruments are routed. Well, they used to be that way, anyways, through group faders. There's I don't know necessarily what all the different iterations of the DAW, what happens in the DAW, but basically, when you're mixing in the box, you need to have all of your tracks assigned to a stereo destination, not necessarily a stereo output, because maybe, but you need to combine everything to stereo. In however that process is that you're combining stuff to stereo, this is where you're going to create. This is where you're going to have your master fader. This is the place where all of the tracks are combined through a stereo process. It's the overall path. You can apply effects. Now, I don't mean by effects. I don't mean delay and reverb and pitch shifting and modulation. Not those kind of effects. It's where you can affect or you can manage your mix as a whole. Where you can apply a general EQ to the whole mix, where you can apply general compression to the whole mix, and you can have a final limiting stage. So you've got the 3 key plugins that I mentioned. You've got an EQ, a compressor, and a limiter. Most of in-the-box mixing is done on a stereo mix bus. Now, we will talk about parallel compression. You can get super complicated in the mixing process. And if you look at some of the things that are available out there, there's a lot of different ways to go about it and get things done. But the best thing that I'm recommending for you is to start simply, because you can make a great mix this way, and you don't have to overcomplicate it, and you shouldn't overcomplicate mixing. Mixing is definitely complicated enough as it is, and doing it simply is better. So the order that I'm recommending that you do these things is, as the signal passes through your stereo bus, your master fader, the sequence in which you want the audio to pass through these plugins is the EQ first, then the compressor, then the limiter. Okay? I just want to look at the next page real quick. Okay. I just want to make sure. So we're going to start with this basic multiband, and now the EQ that I'm asking you to put on here is a basic multiband parametric EQ. Every DAW has one, and it is easily found. Hopefully, you can pull up one that is a 5-band EQ, and I'll explain why you want a 5-band EQ here as we talk about this. Now, this is not an absolute, but I pretty much do it all the time, and it's like this is a good thing to start with. Is you want to have a high pass filter so if you have 5 bands, your very bottom band, your lowest frequency band, you want to set as a high pass filter. You want to get rid of all the subsonic information, or turn it down, control it, contain it, eliminate some of it. I don't know how many different ways I can say it, but you want to roll some of it off. You want to high pass it. You want to roll off the low frequencies. What it means by you want to roll off a low end with a high pass filter means the filter is set low and lets all the high frequencies pass. Okay, so it's if the language is a little bit confusing, we are setting an EQ at very low, almost as low as your EQ will go. I've said 20 hertz, 20 cycles. That is way lower than any consumer speaker Even subwoofers don't even do 20 hertz very well. They don't do it very efficiently, and there's nothing down at 20 cycles that you're going to miss in recorded music. And actually, when you have too much of it, it will influence the sound of your mix in a negative way. Because what happens is whatever's trying to reproduce the sound, headphones or speakers, if it's, please understand that a speaker moves as fast as the frequencies that it's being asked to reproduce, okay? Obviously, with music, it's full frequency, so the speaker's doing a lot of very complicated movements. But 20 hertz, even I would say anything below 30 hertz is pretty useless. Because it's not musical. It's not part of the sound that the speaker can reproduce. But the speaker will try, and by speaker I don't mean I mean headphones too. But the sine wave for a subsonic frequency is very slow, like this. Okay, if the speaker is trying to do this while it's also trying to do all that high frequency stuff, well, basically having these subsonic frequencies is like putting a brake on the speaker, on the transducer, on whatever is reproducing the sound. So by getting rid of those frequencies that we don't need to hear, don't want to hear, we kind of let we're not asking the speaker to try and create those frequencies, and it frees the speaker up and it makes it more efficient at all the frequencies we do want to hear. And you should play with a subsonic high pass filter. Rolling this low end off. You want to use a pretty steep curve. This is another technical term though, but there's a slope value. And you'll see things like 6 dB, 12 dB, 18 dB, 20, 24 dB. And what that means is how many decibels of gain reduction at that center frequency is it rolling off. And so per octave, if it's a 6 dB slope, per octave, like if the center frequency is at 20 hertz, 1 octave below it at 10 hertz, it will have rolled it off 6 dB. Most of the time, you're going to want to use a slope that is 12 or 18. But you should experiment with them all, and they all have a different sound because the way that they relieve the frequencies above them that the speaker is trying to reproduce. And you're going to also want to play with where that center frequency is. I mean, I wouldn't really recommend taking it much above 30, or at least not with a very steep slope. But, sometimes I only roll off at 15 hertz, and I don't really need to do much of it. It just depends on how much low frequencies are in the mix and in the content that you're mixing. Okay? Very, very, very lengthy explanation on that. But then that gives you your other 4 bands to kind of shape and kind of tailor make the sound of your mix. So this is where we've taken that static balance, and now we're starting to make some general adjustments to it and adjust the general tone and shape of the energy of the mix. A finished mix needs to have energy and a lift in the high frequencies. It needs to be articulate. It needs to have energy and sort of some snap. You don't want it to be overly bright, but it's just like, this is where you're in a mix, you're kind of making the sound smile a little bit more. You're kind of opening the top end and making things a little bit brighter and finding the places where all these things work, getting your high frequencies organized and accentuated is, that's how you kind of widen your stereo field. And also playing with, it'll help bring out some of those juxtapositions and those contrasts that you've created internally within your tracks. Typically, after I do the high pass filter, I will set a high frequency shelf. Maybe 10K, maybe 14K, 12K, just somewhere, and just boost. Now, hopefully all of you understand the difference between a bell curve and a shelf. A bell curve kind of takes a center, like my fingertips are the center frequency. It takes the frequencies around it and raises it with it as kind of like in the shape of a bell, or dips them, right? A shelf acts like here, if my sleeve my wrist is the center frequency. It's like if this is 12K here and I turn it up a little bit, it raises it up a little bit like a shelf. Okay, I'm sure most DAWs, this EQing is visual, and so you kind of have an understanding what I'm talking about. Find the place where you can put a high frequency shelf, like, kind of move it around, fish around for it a little bit. See what starts to sound good and doesn't over boost the mid range, because it's not just boosting from 12K and above, it's boosting below it as well, and it starts to draw up some of that upper mid range. Just sort of see where that sweet spot is, where it starts to kind of like brighten your whole balance, your whole start to your mix, kind of opens things up and kind of gets things to be a little bit brighter. The reason I'm asking you to do that is because instead of going in and adding high end to each individual track, which is a lot of work, it involves a lot of individual decision making, and EQs, especially digital ones, in high frequencies, there are technical issues with doing a lot of EQ, and it will be more cohesive and better for the end result if you start with a general EQ and kind of accentuate the high frequencies for everything in the way that you have it balanced. You've got a relationship. You might have a dull record, not dull, maybe that's wrong, like a darker, warmer sounding record. You might have a brighter sounding record. And then this is a way to kind of shape that. Maybe if you have a brighter sounding record, you don't need to add as much of the high frequency shelf. Maybe you just need a little bit of air, and it's just, you're gonna have this shelf just maybe a dB at 16K, because you've already kind of like bright feeling sounding record, and you just need to kind of like pop the top end up a little bit, just kind of give it a little bit more air. And where you're going to be working is what we're going to get to next, is where it kind of get to like kind of fatten the bottom up and kind of make it feel a little bit warmer. But maybe you got this warm record and you want to kind of like lift everything up as opposed to doing it individually. It's going to sound better if you do it as a whole. And because if you've done an adequate job recording your record, as you add everything, you're gonna be adding things to fit together, and so it's all gonna hang together a certain way. Anytime I get a record to mix from a third party, I just sort of listen to it and evaluate, some genres of music and recording styles. They are more about the mid-range, more about the low end, more about the, it just depends. And so you kind of want to respect how it all hangs together and it's glued together, and then add an EQ curve to the whole thing that kind of fills it out and brings it into a more balanced and bigger, wider place. It saves you adding EQ to every single track. And then the EQing you're doing on all the individual tracks is more about individual frequency management and trying to get sounds to fit together. Typically, you end up managing more of the mid-range, because if you've accentuated all the highs across the board, then you're not having to like turn everything up, all high end across everything. You're kind of just managing the mid-range. Now, on your keyboards, you might want those brighter. So yeah, you might need to add some 6K to your keyboards. Your drum overhead or overheads, you might want to turn up some more high frequencies, because in relation to everything else, even though you've turned up the brightness for the whole mix, you still might need to shine up those overheads a little bit. And you might want to roll off more of the low end there. You might want to actually use a high pass filter on the overheads that's higher. Maybe you might want to use a high pass filter that's as high as 60 or 100, just to kind of get rid of that low frequency sort of messy bleed that's in there and kind of keeps the drums from feeling tight. But by doing this big overall job, you're able to more specialize each individual element, and notch out some of the ugly mid-range and the 200 to 700, that's kind of gets on top of each other. It's all in the fundamental notes and frequencies of the key and the instruments, and just around 1K, where our ear is really susceptible to hear frequencies really strongly. Then individually you're just shaping and sculpting each sound to sort of fit together and to fit the bigger picture. Well, just it's not in here, but let's carry on. So we've so typically what I'll do is I'll put that the high pass, open up the top end with a shelf, and then I might look around for just a little gentle small bell curve somewhere in the upper mid range, somewhere just to kind of give myself a little bit of that articulation and forward feel that is needed on the lead vocal, on the snare drum, the kick drum, and just all the primary stuff that lives in the upper mid range. I'll look around for something like anywhere from 3 to 5,000 cycles, kilohertz, to where I just kind of boost a little bit of that, and it's just like to sort of find that sweet spot to where kind of like everything sort of starts to speak really well. I want to do too much like subtractive EQ on the mix bus, at least not right away. So we've used, if we say that our 5 bands 1 through 5, 1 is the lowest one that we've turned into a subsonic filter. 2 we haven't touched yet. 3 in the middle we haven't touched yet. 4 is that 3 to 5K little sweetening, just a little gentle. Not too wide of a bell, not too narrow, because as chords and keys, as chords move and tones shift, the frequency spectrum kind of changes a little bit. So you kind of want something that's slightly broad and kind of fits the tone of accentuating that. And then our 5th band is that upper shelf. Okay, so number 3 band, the middle band, for now we're just going to leave that alone. We're going to save that for once we kind of get our mix going a little bit, we get it more developed, and we might need to do just a little bit of extra help to kind of peel back a little bit of that cloudy mid-range that we're going to be addressing individually. And then on the number 2 band, which is basically our low frequency band that we can now accentuate, you might want to give it a little bit of a small, gentle bell around anywhere from 60 to 100 hertz, just to kind of give it a little bit of that impact. And so what we're doing is we're creating that little bit of that smiley face. We're kind of giving it that little bit of push on the extremities to kind of get things to pop a little bit. And then when we're kind of carving away at our individual sounds and kind of cleaning up some of the unnecessary mid-range or just accentuating the parts that are really audible and kind of make things fit in all their little places, it'll all kind of come together that way. And we're going to save that 3rd band for later. Once we've kind of got things going and kind of made our mix moves, and kind of it can be kind of like our little finishing touch. It's like, I'm going to pull down a little bit. I'm going to pull down like a 1/4 dB or 1/2 dB at like 800 cycles or 1,000 cycles or something. And I'm not saying, this is not about like setting this EQ and forget it. It's just like, let's get our balance. Let's get our mix sounding even a little bit more finished with just in one place. And you kind of come back. We're going to come back to this. Or we're going to review this. We're going to kind of maybe adjust it. It's like, oh, well, now that I've been carving the mid-range a little bit and kind of turning some things up, and I brighten the overheads and I brighten my piano a little bit, it's just like that 12K shelf, maybe it can move up a little bit, or maybe it's fine at 12K. I just don't need as much. I don't need 2 dB. I only need 1 dB of it. So it's a process of back and forth and evaluation. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to have a mix bus compressor. I'm going to say something like an SSL style, because it's a pretty easy EQ to use. In terms of sort of like a set it and forget it setting. And most DAWs have an emulation, because it's one of the most popular mix bus compressors in modern music. It's probably one of the most commonly used. It's not used by everybody, but it's widely available and it's pretty easy to use. Okay, so like in Pro Tools, they have a version called Smack, which I mentioned here. Smack and Pro Tools. My favorite one is by a company that the guys that I work with turned me on to, and I've switched over to using it in the box. It's really great. It's made by Cytomic. It's affordable. It's called the Glue, and it is an SSL style compressor. So the way to set the compressor is we're going to turn, now earlier when we were talking about 1176, I said most compressors you had a fixed threshold and you had a variable input gain to work against the fixed threshold. There isn't an input gain on a SSL style compressor. You just have the threshold. There's no way to adjust the input. The only way to adjust the input is to turn down what you're feeding it. Which you could do on the output of the compressor. I mean, on the output of the EQ. I mean, the output of the EQ is like if you were hitting the compressor too hard and you had no way to adjust the level into the compressor, you would go to the stage just before it and adjust it there. Because what I'm going to tell you to do is turn the threshold for the compressor all the way up, fully clockwise. And the reason I'm asking you to do this is that we don't want the threshold of the compressor low enough to start acting. We want to get as much sound and level into the compressor as we possibly can before it starts doing its job. And so setting the threshold all the way to its maximum, meaning like as much gain into it before it starts to react fully clockwise, is the way to do it. So we're gonna turn it all. Well, I also forgot to mention that Waves and Universal Audio also have excellent copies of SSL compressors. I mean, there's so many places to get it, and it's probably one of the, like I said, most commonly used. Many famous mixers make it their bread and butter. So, okay, we started how to use this mix bus compressor. We already started to talk about that. We're going to turn the threshold all the way up. That's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to select the lowest ratio on the compressor, which is 2-to-1. Because we're not trying to get this to make our mix for us. We're not trying to get this to squeeze the sound into a place where it's doing the balancing for us, where it's making the loud things quiet and bringing the quiet things up. It's just like that, that's not the best way to mix. It's not completely wrong because people do it and they make successful mixes. But it's going to be the reason I don't recommend it. It's going to be very hard. If you have a mix bus compressor that is compressing a lot and basically mixing your mix for you, if you need to make a change, like if you have a mix bus compressor that is in like 4, 6, 8, 10 dB of compression, well, what do you think is happening? The compressor is squeezing everything into a balance. And if you try to turn something up, you're going to have to turn it way up, because to get it to be louder, you're just going to have to really crank it to make a change and to be able to mix and adjust and create a flow and a dynamic for your mix. You only want the mix bus compressor to be gluing the mix together. You do not want it mixing for you. You want it helping you mix. You should be able to bypass your mix bus compressor. Obviously, your level might change, but your mix, the core and intention and basic balance of your mix should stay intact. Low compression ratio is just there to kind of like tame things. I mean, it's okay to get 2, 3, even sometimes 4 dB of compression. Your mix bus compressor should not be in compression 100% of the time. It should be just kind of tapping down the loud stuff. And when things like there might be a section that gets really loud and everything gets loud, and it's in compression for quite a bit for that section because things are really loud. It'll kind of give a little bit of urgency. That's okay. I'm not saying that's taboo. I'm just saying we want it to be the glue. We just kind of want it to help rein things in and kind of give it a little bit more control and tone. If you push it too hard, you won't have a great mix. Now we want to set the attack at the slowest, which is 30 milliseconds. and then we want to set it for the quickest possible release, which is 100 milliseconds. It'll say if it's SSL style, it'll say, I'm getting tired. We're at 6.5 hours now. It'll say 100 it'll say 0.1 S, which means a tenth of a second, which is 100 milliseconds. Okay, so you want the slowest attack, fastest release. There are other settings on there. You can experiment with them. Other people use some other settings with good results, but they have a different approach than I do. And this is not just the way that I use this. Most mix engineers that have experience and that do good consistent work and use this mix bus compressor, this is exactly how they use it. There's variations from it. I mean, sometimes I might change this. I can't ever think of an instance where I've found necessarily a better general setting. There's no way that you can go wrong with this. I've mixed tons of songs this way and never have to and change it. It's just kind of a set it and forget it setting. And I'm just looking for a little bit of control, a little bit of glue, and just a little bit of gain reduction. I mean, the kick and the bass and the vocal and some loud instrument moments are usually the thing that drive it the most. So you'll see it just kind of tapping on the kick and the snare. And this is sort of like maybe for pop or rock music. In contemporary music, we usually have the rhythmic elements pretty strong, and to sound good, they need to retain a decent amount of transient energy. So. And then the vocal is typically pretty loud or whatever the feature instrument is. And so they'll kind of drive it a little bit. So be looking for those things to be the things that are driving it the most, but not exclusively. Okay, so then the third thing we need is a stereo limiter. And this is a peak stop limiter. I will say that you can EQ after your mix bus compressor. You could add in a fourth plugin, which would be a second EQ. Could be a different style EQ. You might put in a Pultec style EQ just to kind of get a little bit of tone and just to add a little bit more smiley face to it because it's a very simple EQ. You could do another parametric EQ because maybe you need to do a little bit more carving where you've sort of run out of bands. Sometimes it's nice to EQ after a little bit of compression. As a general rule, I would say it's not the way to start. I'm just telling you because there's no hard and fast rules. You will see mix videos, mixers where they've got a whole ton of stuff on the mix bus and they're treating it, and that's fine. I do that sometimes. I employ a much more complicated mixing process than this. But I also use this a fair amount too. And I think this is the best place to start for you to have something that's not overly complicated. It's totally pro, and you'll get a great result without making things too difficult. But I just wanted to briefly mention that, but we're going to go to our third plugin in this scenario, and it's a peak stop limiter. Pretty much every DAW should also have a peak stop limiter. My favorite that I use most of the time now is the Fab Filter Pro L2. There's a lot. I mean, L3 is good. There's which is like an Avid plugin. Waves makes a good peak stop limiter. Precision limiter in Universal Audio. Lots of good stuff. The reason to use it is you just want to make sure that any peaks that you're sort of letting get past your gluing compressor, your stereo bus compressor, it's not a brick wall. It's just kind of gluing things together. It's not totally controlling things. You just don't want to get digital overs. You don't want to be driving things into the red because the output converters are not really going to like it. It's not going to sound good. The mastering engineer is going to have to deal with it and turn it down. You will sound better. You'll hand off a better result. by having a peak stop limiter on the end. The way to use a peak stop limiter is very basic. You're just trying to stop the highest transients, which should be just some of the little overs you're going to get occasionally on those really percussive, impactful instruments, like your drum beat or your percussive sort of. Maybe you don't have drums. Maybe you don't even have drums in your production or your style of music. There's going to be something that's going to be kind of peaking. There's going to be some things that have energy. Maybe not. Maybe you're doing something that's very atmospheric and sound design that doesn't really have a lot of transient energy. That's fine. This won't hurt you to have it there as just a final gatekeeper, if you will. It's just there to stop the highest transients. It's to keep the things that get past the compressor from clipping where you're printing your mix. Okay, so basically, most peak stop limiters, they are just basically set up when you open them up to stop peaks. Sometimes you need to lower the threshold a little bit to kind of grab a bit of the peaks, but they're pretty easy to use. I mean, some are more complicated than others. Because I don't really have one in front of me, it's sort of harder for me to, in my mind, at this hour of speaking to you, sort of conceptualize and convey all the little different parameter iterations you might have, variations. But you're just trying to stop the occasional peak and the overs that you would get in your recording, in your stereo mix recording. And I typically set the output of the limiter to minus 0.5, half a dB below zero, so that I can push up against the limiter and I can get things to clip and peak a little bit when appropriate. You just have to use your ears. You certainly don't want to be peaking and clipping anything too much. Clipping and peaking in the computer on the input of your converter occasionally is fine. Don't be scared about it. Don't think that that's wrong, as long as you don't hear something that sounds bad to you. If it doesn't sound bad to you, then okay. I mean, the converters that I use, they like a little bit of clipping because of the electronics that they have in the analog circuit. It's fine, and actually once it gets into the computer, it doesn't still continue to show up as a peak. So you just want to have it just below clipping, and you want to print your stereo file with no clipping in it. You don't want to depend on the converter that you're listening to, that your file will sound equal on another converter it's clipping. Okay, and it's also just something. It's more professional to hand off an audio file that doesn't have a bunch of clips in it. Just because that's like, oh well, this person doesn't know what they're doing. You're okay. So that's the way you can look up how to and get tutorials on how to set up a peak stop limiter. But those are the basic things that you need to understand. Stopping occasional peaks, and I recommend setting it at minus half a dB. Some people set it at minus a whole dB. I think that's a bit much. You don't really need. I think that half a dB, I think, is technically satisfactory for what almost all output converters will be able to handle and represent the sound of your mix well. Your mix bus needs to be printed into a stereo track in your mixing session, in your session. If you just bounce it to disk and you don't ever really see it, well, then you're not really giving yourself an opportunity to make visual observations. And it's also nice to print. Now, when you're making rough mixes, I would suggest that maybe as you set up a rough mix, set up this mix bus and begin to play with it. But you're going to have to turn it off when you're recording because you don't want to listen through these longer latency plugins, and you don't want to be listening to trying to record to something that's trying to be a finished mix. But so consider printing your rough mixes through something like this. Definitely need to do this when you're making a final mix. The the reason I'm suggesting and asking you to print a stereo, like to print the mix in your session as a stereo track, is so that you can have all the various versions of it to listen to and compare it to the work that you're doing now. Are you getting louder? Are you are you improving upon the previous work? And also, then you can kind of maybe compare it to something else that you want to reference or emulate. And it's good to be sure that in printing it, that it doesn't that both sides of it look appropriate. It's just a good habit to be in. And then you can make playlists. Like in Pro Tools, you can make playlists, and you can just have one track where you just, every time you do a new updated version of the mix, that you're printing it there, and then you can just switch playlists and listen to an older version of the mix. And did I make an improvement? It's just a good habit to be in. And like, what if you only need to update a certain part of your mix? Well, you don't need to necessarily print the whole mix. You can just punch in that bridge section that you need to update. There's a lot of good reasons to do it. And if you're making, let's say you have that rough mix, and you're going to start from zero with everything, you're going to kind of build it up. Well, you can, on that record track, you can flip it in and out of input. And when it's an input, you're hearing the mix you're making. And when it's out of input, you're hearing playback. So you're hearing your previous mix. And so then you have a quick and easy way to reference where you were and where you're going back to, or what you're doing new. Hopefully that makes sense. And if not, you'll ask me a question about it. It also allows you to turn the effects, meaning the process of the EQ, compression, and limiting that you're putting on your mix. You're able to turn them off and compare an unaffected or unprocessed mix bus with an older mix, or just with where you are now. Hopefully that makes sense. Sorry, I feel like I lost a little bit of the thread there. I've been doing really good, and I'm getting a little bit weary, but I promise I will keep this focused and going forward. Okay. Using reference mixes, reference tracks while mixing. It can be done. I would recommend, and that's what I was just talking about, where you're comparing what you're doing with something else. Well, I mentioned this much earlier in the day, where if you've brought in that song that you're emulating, or that something that represents that genre of music that you're trying to using as your yardstick, it's if you have it, then it's a finished, most likely it's a finished, commercially available mix, and that means it's going to be mastered, and it's going to be louder and shinier and more polished sounding than what you've got going at the moment. And sometimes that can be a little defeating. It can skew your perception and distract you from staying focused on what you're doing. I think it's better to take notes on something, and maybe if you're going to make a comparison, go, instead of doing it in your session on your speakers, go listen to your mix versus that other song in your car or on your headphones or something. Get out of that. Get out of there. Get out of in front of your speakers in your DAW. Can be done. I just recommend don't overdo it. Be careful. I have really screwed myself up in the past, even listening to my own work, trying to chase another mix that I did on another record, that I thought was a great mix, or that was a successful record, and it can be really hard. It's not an equal comparison. There's so many things that make these things different, and it kind of, in a way, if you're not doing it carefully, you can do yourself a disservice, and kind of confuse confuse your work and kind of take your eye off the prize. So just be very careful with doing it. Focus on creating your own production. There's plenty of ways to review and check your material. Don't, it's like so emotional. I get so, when I'm starting to mix a record, even if it's my record that I've been working on or mixing a record for somebody else, it's like, I'm nervous. I'm like, I want to do a good job. Am I going to do a good job? Am I going to be able to do this again? Am I any good? I mean, I know that on some levels I'm good because I have the experience and I have a proven track record, but I'm a human being too. And, I show up and what kind of skews things is you never know what, even though I might feel good about myself, you never know if somebody else is going to, if the person that you're trying to work on the behalf of, if they're going to like what you do. You've always sort of got that little voice in the back of your head. So, when you're all working on your own, don't be your own worst enemy. Don't take yourself out of like a focused, balanced emotional place. I mean, at the end of the day, all this stuff we're talking about, it's really technical and there's all these techniques. But not everybody, some people, they have the heart of a technician and they get a lot of joy from that. And everyone that does this is an artist, but some people lean more technical and they're not as emotional. I know myself. This is me producing myself. This is me, stepping outside of myself and knowing myself. I'm like an emotional person. I can be, I can be on a roller coaster sometime, and I just need to guard against, faking myself out, taking myself out of my element, taking myself away from, my confidence. And, so when I start a mix, the first mix usually takes me the longest. Now, for several reasons, because I'm trying to get the hang of, the record and getting that stamp on it, understanding how it's put together and kind of getting a feel for it and making all the right moves, checking the right, or gathering the right kind of gear, the right approach, doing my homework. And then things start to go fast. You should, it's much in the same way that I advise you that you should pick sort of the middle of the pack song to record. I think you should understand the material that you're going to mix, whether it's your own or someone else's, and just kind of pick that easier, what you feel like is an easier thing, the thing that's got the song that's got the most common instrumentation across the whole record. It should have drums in it. Don't start trying to mix it. If there's drums on the record, start with a song that's got drums on the record or programming. Do the stuff that is going to be maybe not the most complicated or the single or the easiest. Sort of start in the middle. Get established. Get in there. Get going. And then kind of get a reaction from those that are listening to know how well you're doing. And then that's also a way to interpret what their vision is for things and how aligned you are with it, and where maybe you've not totally got it yet, and where you need to sort of like develop your thinking and feel for it, and so forth and so on. So that was a little bit of a sidebar, but you've got to focus on yourself. Focus on what you're doing. Don't be distracted. Now, you can either have it in a separate, I suggest having it in a separate audio track because it's a finished record, it's going to be louder than what you're doing. Even when you're done, please try not, please don't try to mix something as loud as a finished record. That's not the way to do it. That's what mastering is for. Even if you're mastering yourself, that's another step, and we can touch on that at the end. But the reason to have it in a separate track is so you can turn the gain of it, so you can turn the comparative volume of it down to match more what you're doing. So when you switch back and forth between the two things, it's not going to blow you out of the water and be so much louder and more. Volume can be more impressive. Half the trick with some plugins that you get from some companies is it's just louder than the other, the competitors' plugin, or it just makes some plugins are designed that when you turn them on, the volume and loudness of the the track that it's on doesn't change. It doesn't make it louder. Some plugins bump it up just a little bit before you touch any of the settings, just so you automatically feel better about it, because louder sometimes can be better. Or that's the perception. So just make sure that you put the volume at an equal footing. That's why I'm suggesting you putting it on a different track. If you have it on a playlist, like if you're in Pro Tools and you have it on a playlist that you can kind of flip between where you're printing your own mix and where it is, just clip gain the file down to the appropriate level. I'm not really sure how all DAWs work. I think probably the smartest and easiest thing to do is just keep it on a separate track, and then you just kind of keep it muted until you want to hear it. Okay, so step 3, parallel compression for drums. And this applies to sample drums, program drums, a little bit less to program drums, because a lot of samples are just layered up and sort of already jacked up to where they have that really impactful, concentrated, punchy sound. But this kind of would generally apply to anything that's percussive, that has a lot of transient energy, and you're trying to fatten it up and make it feel like it has that kind of balled up and really energized, forceful punch energy to it. So we've got our mix bus that we've set up and talked about, and then all the tracks have been assigned to that mix bus. So, and that's fine. This is where we're going to start out with the drums. But then we're going to assign our drums to its own little mix bus, and like it's a in Pro Tools it's an aux bus. So I'm gonna all my tracks, let's say they're assigned to outputs 1 and 2, okay? I've made my master fader go to outputs, is on outputs 1 and 2, and I'm affecting everything I'm hearing on outputs 1 and 2. I'm going to create, for the drums, I'm going to now create an auxiliary bus so that I can add parallel compression to them. And so I'm going to create 2 auxiliary paths, and I'm going to make both auxiliary paths have the same input. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that it's bus 1 and 2, and then both of those auxiliary paths, I'm going to assign both of those outputs to output 1 and 2, where the drums were going originally. So now the drums are passing through these 2 auxiliary paths. Does that make sense? All the drums are now, the outputs of all the drum tracks are assigned to bus 1 and 2. And it can be whatever. I'm just giving you an example. Bus 1 and 2, these 2 auxiliary paths, both are assigned to bus 1 and 2, and then their outputs are assigned to where the drums were. So it's like another path, mix bus path, on the way to my final mix. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to put a little bit of overall EQ on my drums, and I'm going to do it the same on. So I'm going to, to start, I'll turn off one of the aux paths, and I'm going to EQ my drums. And once I establish what that EQ is going to be, like it's an overall EQ. It's sort of like how I'm treating the overall for the mix bus, but now I'm doing a little bit of particular group EQ for the drums. Once I've established what that should sound like, then I'm going to put it on the other auxiliary path that's been muted. So I have the same exact EQ on both paths. So I'm not getting any weird differences that that will happen when you're doing 2 different EQs on the same, basically what you want to be a parallel path. And then on one of the paths, now I'm going to unmute them. They're both going to be unmuted. On one of the paths, I'm going to put a compressor. And I'm going to set what is a very aggressive compression setting. You can use anything. I'd probably not use the SSL compressor. Just use a different compressor. I want something that's going to be in compression a lot and kind of stay in compression. And you're going to have to sort of play with it to sort of see what sounds appropriate. Usually the attack is a bit faster, the release is a little bit slower, just so it kind of like is like it clamps down on the sound quickly, kind of holds it in place. And I'm going to turn either the output of that compressor down significantly, or I'm going to turn that aux path. I got two aux paths. I'm going to turn that one down that has the compressor on it down. And then because I'm going to blend it back in. So what I have going on here is all the drums are going to two paths, and this is where we get into the parallel compression. The uncompressed path is going to represent somewhere around 60% of my sound, and I'm going to blend in the brutally or somewhat more compressed sound and it kind of be 40% of the sound. And that's how I'm creating parallel compression. I'm getting this really cool, beat up, aggressive compression sound that I'm blending in, but I'm not put it on the whole drum kit sound. It still has all the transient and all the beautiful sound that I've recorded and the way I've got it EQ'd and balanced, and it's not been it hasn't been overly affected by the compression, but now I have this compression sound that I can blend in. That would be the typical way to do it, because not every compressor plugin has a mix knob. If you want to use a compressor that has a mix knob, you can use just one aux path, because after the EQ, when you put that compressor on there, you can set it up with a kind of a tough compressor setting, and then just blend in a little bit of that sound, and that's parallel compression. And that is kind of an essential process to get, especially acoustic drums or acoustic drum samples, to sound finished and mixed and modern. And it will work for programmed elements. And you can adapt that process for anything really if you want. It really can kind of help create the feeling of that condensed, compressed, contained sound without affecting the good, natural, bright, transparent, dynamic sound that you already have, and you can kind of mix and match them to taste. I mean, the 60-40 blend is just a place to start. I mean, you could be 50-50. It could be the compressed sound could be the dominant sound, and you just kind of add a little bit of the uncompressed sound in for clarity. It becomes a taste choice. Yeah, so this is kind of continues on with what I've been speaking about. You have the compressor output low. You balance the drums to hear them through the unprocessed channel. You raise the output of the compressor until you hear the compression in the drum mix. We talked about the 60-40. Play with this, get the sound you like. Can be done in a single track if you use a compression plugin that has a blending knob. I need to drink some water. Send the output of the aux tracks to your mix bus so you can hear the effects in your mix. This process can be done with other instruments to have them sit in your mix in the way that you desire. I'm sure that I'll get some questions about that. Okay, the next thing to do is set up vocal effects. Considering, you need to consider adding various effects for different parts of the song. Delay is effect in the chorus. So what I typically do is, we talked about it earlier, how you set up aux buses for your effects returns, and you send to those aux buses from your vocal channel. This again is something you can do with your drums. If you want to add drum reverb, you don't put reverb on your whole drum kit. You maybe just want it on the snare drum and the toms. So you set up a reverb that's just specifically for the drums. You send from the snare drum, from the toms to the compressor, and then you blend it in with your drum sound. You can do that with guitar, everything, keyboards, whatever you want, whatever your heart desires. This is the place where you can kind of create new sounds. I just want to simply talk about and focus on the vocal effects because it's probably the most complicated mixing environment that I create for an individual sound. And so what I do is I will create 5 or 6 auxiliary paths for effects for the vocals. 2 of them will be for delays, different delays. One will be for a short slap delay. One will be for a longer delay. I typically, in the same way that I set up the drums to go to the same input on the aux bus, for my delays on my vocal, I will make the input for both delays the same send from the vocal track. So we've already used bus one and two for the drums, so I got to go to bus 3 to now send to my vocal delays from my vocal track. So bus 3 is an assignment from my vocal track as an effect send, not my track output. It's an effect send, and I'm hoping that you guys are knowledgeable enough that you understand that. And then so my two delay buses, my two auxiliary buses. Now the vocal is still assigned to output 1 and 2, and the output of all my effects is output 1 and 2. But the input for my two delay effects for my vocal are both bus 3. One has a short delay, one has a long delay, and then I send the appropriate level to them to where the vocal effects are getting a good healthy amount of level to where they sound good. I'm not, an effect has a different characteristic depending on how much level you send to it. A reverb will start to sound dark and clouded and kind of muddled the more level you send to it, because it's replicating the sound of a room. And the louder that something is in a room, the more excited the room gets, and the more reflections you have, and the more just busy and cloudy it sounds. So, reverbs work much the same way because they're emulating that sound, and they're designed to work that way. So obviously, if I'm speaking very quietly in a room, well, you're not going to hear much reverb. So how loud I speak in the room affects the color of the effect. So it's important how much level you push into the effect. And then once you kind of get the effect to sound appropriate, then you balance the output level into the mix of the effect. I mean, typically you're going to want to have the long delay off because maybe you don't want it in the verses and you only bring it in for the choruses, or it's just very low the whole time, almost to the point where it's there, but you don't really hear it until you bring it up some. You're going to balance that short delay appropriately. And then we're going to move on and we're going to do 2 reverb paths. We're going to send from effect send number 4, and we're going to have 2 different kinds of reverbs, a short and a long reverb. And the reason I have all these different effects is just so that I have things in place and I can play with them. I can either use both reverbs, or just the short reverb, or just the long reverb. I can use them in combination. I can use the short reverb for the verse. I can use a long reverb for the chorus. It's just all in place. It's really simple. It's part of my template, as you will. I set it up from the beginning and kind of get a sound. And then for a 5th channel, I would set up a micro pitch shifter. I talked about it earlier in the example of using it on acoustic guitar. Using a micro pitch shifter on it just kind of gives a little bit of vocal. It just kind of gives it a little bit of texture and depth and width. I don't necessarily want to hear the overly affected sound of it. I just kind of I bring it up to where I sort of start to feel the vocal sort of get a little thicker and widen out a little bit and feel a little bit a little more substantial, a little bit richer, and then that's it. I don't want to hear it. I mean, sometimes I use it as an effect to where it's pronounced. It's also a good thing to have. I'll use it. I'll boost it up in certain sections, or if somebody's really going for a vocal performance, or the tone of their voice gets kind of thin, if they're really singing out, and they lose a little bit of that tone to their voice and the harmonic overtones of their voice, that's a great sound to be able to push up and kind of sort of add back in some of that tonal support for the voice. There's lots of other things you can add. Sometimes I set up an oral exciter as a 6th path for the vocal sound, and what that does is it's just kind of it creates upper, in the way that a subharmonic synthesizer creates synthesizes low frequencies. A an oral exciter to kind of create some high frequency content, give the vocal a little sparkle. It's just something you just kind of blend in just a little bit of. I often kind of compress and limit the output of whatever the harmonic exciter is a bit, so that it because it's high frequencies, and a vocal, if it's dynamic, the amount of accentuation that the oral exciter is giving me can be varied, and I kind of want to just like smash it into place, and so that it's a very consistent tone and volume, and just kind of blend a little bit in. It's kind of like, it's just like this little kind of shimmer and buzz that's in there. So that's the way to set up some vocal effects. I think that that's very important. I think that it's also important that like an older style of mixing and production would be that you had, because really they didn't have that many tools available to them. They maybe had one echo chamber, and they had one tape machine that they could dedicate to like a tape delay. So they basically had to choose what would go to those particular effects, or they would just use them as group effects. I typically like to do an individual effect for, if I want an acoustic guitar reverb for an acoustic guitar, that's the only thing I'll set it up and use it for. I won't put the keyboard in it or the background vocals. I'll do separate and discrete effects paths for those other instruments. Your vocal sound should already have a certain sound to it applied during the recording process. Now, what that means is you should have already probably created a little bit of effects when you were recording, and as you're kind of building your record, doing your production, you need to have a little bit of that as you go, not wait to figure it out until the end. And once you've recorded a vocal and you've made that first comp, you're going to want to put some EQ and compression on it to sort of get it to sit and begin to figure out what that process is. I'm not saying that you should record too much of that stuff. I'm saying that as you make your rough mixes, you need to put that stuff on there. Now, if your DAW doesn't allow you to keep those things running, or you can't record with those sounds on there, you're going to need to bypass them when you record. You're going to need to take them off when you record. What you can do is you could freeze, like a lot of DAWs will allow you to freeze a process sound. Kind of, experiment. Get something, freeze it. Don't add the latency and suck up the processing power as you get, freeze it when you're ready to revise it and play with it. Unfreeze it, change some parameters. You're gonna have to turn that stuff off to record and then put it back on. It's like, this is a process. It's the only way I know when I sit down to mix something, sometimes it takes me hours to sort of figure out things, and I have to do a lot of auditioning, like, well, what's going to be the best EQ for this person's voice that I've never heard before? But I'm more advanced, so I can make those decisions faster. You're going to be like auditioning stuff and trying stuff and turn it off. Just don't do it in a way where you can't get back to something. Set yourself up to succeed. Start to define your recording as you go. With the vocal, you got to be careful with the vocal and not record too much. Like everything else, I would say, record boldly, make things affect, like if you want delay on the drums or guitar part, maybe it's cool to record it, and that becomes the sound of the recording. But you got to be careful with the vocal. Instead of figuring out the vocal sound, it should be figured out how you want the vocal to sit in the mix. Instead of figuring out... Yeah, so it's hard to figure out what you want. I guess what that note, and I mean, because these notes were put together with a group of people, and maybe I'm not interpreting it maybe the way I said it, but... Instead of figuring out the vocal sound, it should be figuring out how you want the vocal to sit. Yeah, I guess that's what I'm talking about in the sort of the process of, record the vocal simply in a way that you can repeat it, and experiment with how you want it to sound in the final outcome as you're making rough mixes and updating things, but don't commit to that sound, because the vocal is so tricky to get to come together in a final mix. Sometimes it has to occupy a very special place. So that's, you need to, instead of, well, I guess what that's trying to say is, instead of trying to figure out how to record the vocal sound, that's the one thing I say that I think you need to record simply. Experiment with it along the way, but the vocal is the one thing that you're going to need to make the most decisions about the way it sounds in the end. But do your homework along the way. Figure out how it's going to sit in the mix as you go. Okay. Step 5, individual track EQ and effects. After your stereo mix bus EQ has glued your mix together, now is the time to start making those individual tracks sit in your mix. And this is what I was talking about before. Just for example, a bass instrument. Now this means a synthesizer, any kind of bass instrument. A lot of times they tend to be now this is not an absolute rule of thumb, but they tend to be a little bit congested and muddy sounding in like the 100, more like starting at 150 up to maybe 400. Just kind of get this extra little bit of buildup where sort of you need to do just a little carving there, let's say. That would be a place to do a little bit of carving and sort of, I mean, it's not a lot. You don't have to dip out a lot. For me, typically I do not EQ things very dramatically or drastically. If I'm boosting or cutting more than 3 or 4 dB, to me that's a lot. Typically I'm doing things in 1-2 dB. A kick drum, if I'm kind of trying to get out some mid-range around 500, I may pull it down like 5 or 6 dB. There are exceptions, but as a general rule, if you're doing that much EQ, then you may not be EQing the right spot, or there's something else in some other instrument that's sort of not fitting. It's like it's not fitting together with what you're doing. You need to brighten the bass instrument up a little bit, and usually where the articulation in that instrument is going to be is like 1.5K, 2K, or an octave above it, like 4K. And also, just while we're talking about EQing individual tracks, a good way to train your ear is if you have individual tracks of something, great. Maybe spend a little bit of time EQing that, do some research, but put that favorite song of yours in your DAW and take a parametric EQ, and like FabFilter has a little, like when you put a band in and you start to EQ, it has a little headphone symbol. You can click on that and it filters it out and just kind of lets you hear that band. Train your ear to listen to a full mix that you like, a production, and put a multi-band EQ on it and just like EQ it. Figure out where frequencies lie and where instruments in the spectrum are, how they're put together. Listen to very narrow bands of solo up those bands and listen to what instruments or what elements can you hear at 1K, at 4K. Just train your ear, and you'll begin to understand that. Hey, you can understand where these things are put together. It's like, well, I hear the bass instrument down here in the bottom, certainly 60 hertz to 100, and I still hear it certainly up around 400 cycles, but I hear less of it, and that's where I'm starting to hear more of the instruments that are playing the melody. And the vocal is kind of going to be in that, 200 all the way up to 10K range, but it's going to have the places where it's more audible than others. You're going to begin to realize and understand where these pockets are for frequencies, and how to go about individually EQing things to have them fit together and glue, and kind of glue together, and make the individual tracks sit in the right places in your mix. Not everything needs high end on it. Sometimes if something is meant to be loud, you need less high frequencies on it. If something is meant to be quiet, maybe it needs more high frequencies, so that as it sits in the back of the mix, in the back of the room, if you will. The most important things that will grab the ear are the articulation of it and the brightness of it. If it's meant to be quiet, having a lot of low frequency, it's not really going to matter. And it's also going to, frequencies mask each other. And you need to learn about making just little adjustments where things kind of pop out and sit into place. Use EQ to brighten guitar riffs or delay to fill the stereo space. Okay. Let's say you have one guitar track, and it's panned all the way to the left. Well, I mean, that's fine, but to get it to fill the stereo space a little bit and to have a little bit more life, I often put just like delays on guitars. Like a dotted eighth note can be a great delay time for a lot of electric guitar parts. It's not, you can't put it on all the parts because then everything has sort of the same rhythmic signature. But you know, if I've got a guitar track and I've got it all the way left, I'll create a dotted eighth note delay for it, and I'll pan it about 40-50% of the way over to the other side, and it will. And it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have to be really audible. Sometimes you might detect it, but you'll notice how it draws the sound across. It kind of makes it more playful and fills the space and bounces around a little bit. Reverb, you can treat reverb the same way. And oftentimes, if you have these things on the edge, I said use EQ to brighten guitars. You just need to lift a little bit of the really high frequencies to get it to feel like, for the image to be wider and for it to just sort of sit on top. Make sure all the tracks in your mix have the sound you want. Well, what I mean by that is when you're listening to all the tracks together, do you hear the most important aspects of each part? And it doesn't mean that everything has to have an equal sound or everything has to sound great on its own. That's a big piece of advice I have for you, is when you're mixing, try to listen to the tracks all together as much as possible. Start that way, make your static mix, and make your EQ moves as much as you can with more than just the one track playing. Because it's a relationship. You're not EQing each thing to sound great on its own. If you do that, then they won't ever fit together. It's spend very little time soloing each individual thing. If I know that if I'm listening to my whole mix and it occurs to me that my snare drum's not bright enough, I'll go and I'll start EQing the snare drum. And if I'm not exactly sure of the move I need to make, I'll solo it up and kind of get an idea of. I'll fish around in the frequencies in the area that I think it needs to happen, and I'll find what tells my brain and my ear that, yeah, this is probably the right thing, and then I'll take it out of solo, and it's like, okay, I spent the time to individually solo identify more clearly what I'm looking for, but I need to make the final decision in relationship to everything else. Just be sure that you're doing that. Having a great sound on everything individually is not the way you want to go. I remember way back a long time ago, when I used to do a lot of remixes, I'd get multi-tracks for different, songs that were contemporary at the time. And I just remember there was a Pete Townsend song that we were doing sort of like a mix on, and it's old rock song is a song I knew as a kid. And they sent a copy of the 24 track. Now, it didn't probably sound exactly like the original 24, the master 24 track, because it was a duplicate, but it was really close, and the intention was there. And I was really shocked as a young engineer to get to listen to a multi-track of a song that I had listened to on the radio and knew so well, and it was kind of shocking to me how the individual tracks sounded. That man, these guitars are really bright, and there's like not as much low frequency tone as I thought there was. Well, because the bass was helping out. The other instrumentation in the arrangement was sort of helping the guitar sound fuller at times. It was like, wow, there really is in these background vocals. There's a lot of bleed from the lead vocal. Some things sounded kind of more distorted than I thought they would, and it honestly, individually, I didn't think that any one thing sounded particularly amazing. But when you put it all together, it was spectacular, and it was the song that I remembered. And so that was like a big lesson. You can't, not everything can sound great. It's a relationship. You're mixing. If you put the same amount of salt in a dish that you put in chicken broth or water, it would taste terrible. It would taste like salt, because salt goes a long way. Not everything can be in equal measure. It's a combination, and the finesse at which you do that is really important. One more thing that I want to say that it kind of rewinds a little bit in the mixing process is when I start a mix, I do my static balance. I listen to everything. I get everything working. I get my stereo bus decided on. I get that started. I start to do like my drum parallel compression, get my vocal effects going, and then I turn some things off. Then I go to the rhythm section. I'll spend just a little bit of time with just the drum tracks and just kind of make a little. I know how they sit in the whole thing because I've made my static mix, but then I'll sit with my drums and I don't know, 5, 10, 15 minutes, depends on how long it takes. And I'll start to do a little bit more refinement because having listened to the whole thing, I know where I need to head with my drums. Then I'll add my bass in. I'll make sure that the bass level with the drum level feels about right. And then I'll put some of the other instrumentation in, the guitars, the keyboards, the strings, the horns, whatever the heck it is. And kind of do a similar process, tidying those things up. But I try to get to the vocals as quickly as possible, and just add. Maybe just listen to solo up the guitars for a second. When I add those in when I've got my drums and bass going, I add the guitars in. I say, okay, great. And I mute the drums and bass for a second and do just a little bit of that special adjustment to the guitars, and then I put those three things together, and then I move on. And I don't spend a lot of time because I don't try to finalize each sound as I go. It's because it's a progression. I just work it until it feels like, okay, things are sitting together better. I've carved out a little bit more space, and now and I want to hear the vocal the whole time. The vocal is going to be the most important thing a lot of times in music, because in popular music it's kind of one of the forward things. It's the story of the song. As an artist, that's sort of the message of your song, and it carries the top line melody. Those things are important. You need to hear that stuff. So I kind of go through that process, but I'm constantly working through things, revisiting things. I don't overspend time. If I feel like I got close on the drum sound, and then I added the bass and then moved on to the other instruments and the vocals, I may not feel like I nailed the snare sound yet, but I got to get some other things in order before I can go back and decide how bright or how loud that snare drum is going to be. And then I kind of get that stuff progressed, and I go look at my mix bus. Well, how am I doing over here? Am I compressing enough? Am I compressing too much? Should I adjust my stereo EQ that I set up a little bit? Now that I've individualized things, do I need to consider where my top shelf is, or my little upper mid-range boost? Do I need to change that? And then kind of keep going back and forth and working on those things. And then I get to the place where I feel like everything's sitting together, and then it's time to do the automation. Now, not all of you will have a control surface or a way to automate the faders, but a really important part of mixing is getting things pumped up, getting things EQ'd, getting them balanced, effects fitting around each other. But mixing, the art of mixing, which is a skill that you need to develop, is the volumes of things need to change. The compressors are not going to do all of the volume writing for you. If you depend on them to do that, you'll have a very you'll have a hard time making a mix that feels dynamic and magical and loud and important and addresses the movement of things, because you're going to want to turn up some effects in certain moments. You want to add a little. You need to do vocal ride moves. The vocal's not going to be the same volume all the time, and you need to kind of make those adjustments. There's certain little moments in the instrumentation that needs to be enhanced or get quieter at certain points, and maybe just the way things are recorded, it's not, it doesn't sit in the right spot the whole time, and so you need to turn it up and turn it down, and you need to begin to automate things. I do it with a control surface right here, and I'll go through and I'll just start. It depends. It depends on the song and the production and how I'm feeling. Maybe what feels like needs the first attention. Sometimes I start with the vocal. Sometimes I start with the drums. Sometimes I start with the background vocals. It's like what needs to be leveled out and addressed first. That's kind of where I start. And I start writing automation. You can do it with a mouse. You can draw it in if you want. I like doing it this way because it's something I can touch, and I can sit in front of the speakers and I can just adjust the volume, and it's like really interactive and fun for me. But that's, learning to do that is a very important part of the mix. You need to be sure that it's not just about EQing and compressing things into place where a static mix. Sometimes a static mix can make it'll be a fine mix, but I promise you, if you do a little bit of volume automation, at a minimum, it will get better. It will get magical. It'll have a feel to it. It will have a movement to it. And even in bigger sections, the louder sections, I'll take the overhead or the room mics I have for the drums, and I'll turn them up a little bit. I'll nudge them around a little bit. I'll kind of make it feel like it's getting louder. It gives a sense of the feeling of something like, we've got the drums like close mic'd and a little bit blown up with some parallel compression, and they're very in their place, right? But if I just left them that way in the mix, in the bigger sections of the songs where the vocal got loud and I was turning up maybe some of the melodic parts or the musical instruments a little bit, the drums would start to sort of sink to the background. They need to keep up. The drummer, if it was a performance, the drummer would be playing harder, but because we've got the sound kind of reined in and dialed in, it doesn't really quite have that breathing, moving, dynamic feel. So I'll just turn the room mics up a little bit, and I'll kind of push them around. I don't keep them up necessarily at one static place. I'll push them up and kind of wiggle them around, move them side to side. And I'm just talking about like a few dB sometimes, just for that bigger section, and then I'll let them go. Then I'll let them return to sort of like their more stationary, static place. And that's true of everything. Sometimes the bass, if the bass is playing like a little line or something, or sometimes not all the notes on a low frequency instrument speak at the same. They don't cut through a mix the same way. You got to turn certain things up. I'll turn the bass up at the beginning of a chorus. Sometimes I'll keep it up for the chorus, but just make sure it kind of hits a little bit harder. Got to ride the background vocals in and out. Things just sort of need their feeling. It's that illusion of everybody playing on one microphone and doing their job about getting closer and getting farther away and creating that perspective. That's what you're doing. That's when you become the magician, and you pull off you pull the rabbit out of the hat and you make the illusion come to life. I think that's super important. There's something else that I was thinking of a second ago that I wanted to say. It'll probably come to me, or one of you will ask me a really smart question, and it'll come back. Okay, I'm ahead of myself. Okay, so we talked about the automation. While your recordings will have dynamic range, last chorus being louder and more emotional, your recordings have dynamic range, but we're mixing them, gluing together, containing them. You need to sort of breathe those things into it, like I was talking about. You'll need to automate and adjust the volume of your tracks in order for your mix to sound right. And by that I mean to come to life. You think of it like you're the conductor for an orchestra. You're telling this section, play louder. Here, this is the emotion. Effects can dry up. And they can get you can give the sense of the vocal performer sort of becoming emotional and sort of stepping back into all the loud instrumentation and just kind of being loud. Well, what would happen if that was them standing on a stage or in front of a microphone? If they moved away from you or sang to the back of the room, well, it would have a different sound. You can create that sound with the effects. This is how we create emotion and kind of transport the listener into the vibe and the space of the song. You need to know what has to be at the front and the back of your mix at all times. Not everything can be important all the time, and it's a game of deciding. And there's no right or wrong answer. It depends on a feeling. What will make it successful is if you interpret it and present it the right way. And hopefully you've done your work along the way and you begin to understand what that feels like, and you've studied other records, and you can sort of make those observations and create those contrasts and those points of interest and keep things moving and it's like that example I was talking about before. The guitar was very in focus, went away, came back at the end. When certain instruments drop out, or don't play, or they play simpler, or the perspective changes, or the frequency changes. Like the frequencies change. Like sometimes you might add an automated EQ or EQ like for a down chorus or a bridge. You might roll off some of the top end on something, so that it feels darker and quieter and sort of a little bit more intimate, or just not as forceful. And then when it comes back to the next section, you take that EQ off and boom, it's like back to being in your face, or brighter and more commanding. As simple as riding the fader and automating in your DAW. It's time consuming, but gives the finishing touches to your mix. That's how that's how I get finished mixes. I mean, obviously there's a lot that goes into it, and everything we've talked about is very important in the way that it's prepared. But I mean, I know from doing it over and over again and watching the feedback I get from the people that I worked with that that's like, wow, I didn't know it was going to do that. That was really interesting how you made such a difference with just getting involved and that automation. I mean, honestly, I probably spend 2/3 to 3/4 of my time EQing and compressing and creating effects and balancing and prepping and sorting out my mix bus. And it's like sometimes 25% of the effort at the end is the automation. And then of course I've got to go back and assess it and maybe adjust some things. And certainly there's going to be requests and comments to change some things where maybe I made something too loud, or I put too much effect on it, or it's too quiet, or whatever. That my feeling and the thing I was putting into it isn't quite finished. So then you revise it. Sometimes I redo the automation. Sometimes it's just a matter of selecting the automation for a section of something of that penny whistle and turning it down or turning it up or muting it. We already talked about this. Great examples of this would be songs and performances, that you can look at. At the same time, go back to your mix bus. We talked about this. You got to go back and forth to monitor your results in your mix bus. Make sure that the automation you're doing is not overpowering your mix bus. Once you've printed your mix, you can master it or use a limiter on your printed mix. So, okay, this is what I was. You can't do everything in one fell swoop. No, your mix shouldn't be made to be as loud as a finished record. That's what a mastering engineer is for. It's a different process. It's hard to get a great mix and do that all at once. Print your mix, and if you feel like your mix isn't as loud as it needs to be, treat it as a separate process. Take that stereo file of your mix and put it through like a piece of mastering software. Turn it up, make it louder, make it brighter if you need to, EQ it more, but don't try to do it all at once. Do it as a second step. You're at this stage of the game, you're probably better off having someone else master it or not mastering it all. The loudness wars are kind of going away. I mean, certainly it's still very common that music that's put on CD or sort of referenced. I mean, a lot of people mix stuff loud and they send off loud references. They'll make their mix in the way that I'm suggesting, and then they heat it up. They add level to it. They'll put it through like a quick fix process, leveling up plugin to boost up the gain so that it feels more competitive and loud. But that's not what you want to send to the mastering engineer. You want to give them the latitude to make those final touches, put it in the appropriate place. And honestly, for Spotify, they turn stuff down. If you send them loud stuff, they turn it down, and it actually doesn't end up sounding as good as the stuff that they don't touch or that they turn up. Why do you think old music, even though it doesn't necessarily sound fidelity-wise as the same as what we're doing now, but old music, a lot of older music like 60s and 70s, 80s music, it sounds really good on all kinds of platforms. Why do classic rock stations always sound great? Why do those old songs always why can you crank them up and they just sound good? Is because they're not super loud. They're not busting at the seams with level. And, these streaming services like Spotify, if it gets over a certain loudness, they turn it down. That's how they level the playing field. They don't turn the quiet stuff up. They turn the loud stuff down. And when you turn loud stuff down, it doesn't really sound as good as it could or should. So honestly, there's lots of information you can find about how to sort of level stuff up. And it's fine to do that. It's fine to level it up and share it with people and send it out. But don't send it to your mastering engineer that way. Don't necessarily send it to Spotify that way. Don't necessarily do it at all. And don't think that that's the way to mix. That's, it's just not, in my opinion. Now, there's lots of people that mix loud, and I can probably mix louder than you can, because I've been working on it for a while, but it's not the way to start. You can make a mix louder and brighter and all those things later. That's what mastering is for. And what mastering started out being, the purpose of mastering in the first place was they needed specialized equipment and engineers with a special process to be able to get recorded music shaped into, basically get it on vinyl. And so they needed someone to be able to use limiters and EQs to get the cutting lathe to behave properly, to get as much volume and fidelity as they could cut into the lacquer so they could mass produce records. And then we get into the digital age, and then mastering became about who's got the loudest, most slammed sounding albums. Because when it comes on at like I said earlier, sometimes we equate loudness as better. It's more impressive, but honestly, if you want to have your music pressed to vinyl, if 95% of the time they have to take your digital master and turn it down to get it to fit on there, and they have to EQ it, and they have to make some compromises. and you can't, once you've compressed something, you can't really uncompress it. You can always compress something more. You can't really uncompress it. And if somebody needs to turn something down and uncompress it, you just make the job really, really hard. Okay, so recap. Find a balance among your instruments. Add your stereo mix bus. Explain some parallel compression for the drums. It can apply to everything. You look at tutorials by the way Andrew Sheps does stuff, and he uses a back bus. This is something I do sometimes too. It's a little advanced right now for you, but there's all kinds of ways to use parallel compression, and the back bus on the mix is sort of a way to get parallel compression for your entire mix. Master these simple things. You're not gonna be missing the mark. By doing things simply. Like I pointed out, Mick Gazowski won a Grammy for that Daft Punk record, and he mixes very simply. He leaves the mastering for the expert, and that record is beautiful and dynamic sounding of that album, and that's the proper way to do it. Make sure you get your vocal effects set up, and you've got kind of a little bit of a vibe, so you got things to play with in your production, in your track, and your mixing. Then you're going to get to individual EQ on your tracks and making individual effects, and then you're going to work on your automation and volume adjustments. And you're going to keep checking back with your mix bus and making sure that you're not hitting that peak limiter too much, and you're doing something that sounds good, and it's not done until it's done. On January 2nd, you can re-record that. You can re-record that fifth song. You can record a new song as your fifth song. You can re-record your vocal if you want. You can re-record the guitar, but record with purpose. Take it through the whole process. Make a simple and concise mix process. I mean, it's not that simple. It's not that concise, but don't overcomplicate it. Work on a cover song. Lower the stakes for yourself. You're wearing a lot of hats. Realize, again, I said at the very beginning, I got my first studio job in 1987. Okay. First real major label credit was in 1997. What was I doing for those 10 years? I was earning my stripes and learning how to get things done and watching other people do stuff, successes and failures. Here I am all these years later, and I'm still trying to figure out how to be better. I'm still trying to be inspired, still have fun, keep up with what's going on in technology, listen to new music, listen to the old music I love and bring those influences into it, and just enjoy the people that I'm working with. It really is about communication, relationships, being prepared, and going through a process and not being too hard on yourself. Learn from your mistakes and just trust that you can get better. It's a long process, and stick with it. Okay, additional tips for phase 4. How to know when you're done mixing. This is a good point. Well, for me, it's when I feel like there's not anything. I know when I'm ready to start automation because I feel like all my sounds are sitting there. I've sort of accentuated the things. I've created all the effects for things that feel not like they need effects. I've EQ'd things. There's nothing sort of saying, "Hey, Jacquire, I don't really quite feel right." It's not calling for my attention. And then if everything's feeling balanced, everything is EQ'd, sitting where you want to sit. The volume and I've done my automation. The volume changes appropriately, and I'm not looking for things. I don't go looking for things to keep working on or modify. If I feel comfortable with the way the mix is sitting, the way it's feeling, I may be done. You may be done. You may not be. But it's time to share it. It's time to take a break. It's time to step away. It's time to listen to it in a different setting. When I send a mix out, I hope that the people love it. And sometimes they say, "Wow, great, that's done." Most of the time, there's a comment or two. Sometimes they come back and there's like 20 things they want me to change. Most of the time, it's nothing too dramatic. It's just, it looks like a long list. It's a little daunting at first, but it's like, oh, well, they've taken a whole paragraph to tell me that they want a different reverb on the, on the guitar that's in the bridge. Okay, I can do that. And that's sort of when I know I'm done. When I feel like when everything's sitting comfortably to me, and the person that I'm working on the behalf of says that they like it too, and that they don't have, no more comments. You working for yourself on your own, you just have to take the input that you can get from the outside world, consider it, but don't necessarily bend to it. And when you feel like it's good enough, I don't know that you'll ever feel like anything's finished. I learned a long time ago that I could go on forever making something different, but when it's done, it's done. Art is not perfection. Art is an expression. It's an experience. And when it feels like it got somewhere that feels exciting and comfortable and cool, then yeah, move on. Let it go have its own life. And chances are, when I hear it later, however later it is, I forget about all the struggle and the things that I was worried about, and it just sounds cool to me. And people don't think about that stuff. They don't know what went into it. They don't know. They don't really consider when you listen to music. They just accept it for what it is. It either excites them and draws them in, or it doesn't. And it is what it is, and it's defined. Yep. Which song to start mixing first? Well, just like recording, do something in the middle of the road. I already said that. Mixing a simple track can be as hard as a big production. Big productions are harder to balance. Smaller productions are harder to make perfect. Don't spend too much time mixing soloing tracks. When mixing tracks, try to mix them in groups. Drums, bass, guitars, vocals. Do things so that you have a comparative relationship. Remember that you're mixing in the context of a whole song, not a single track. And by a single track, I mean what the vocal sounds like, or what the kick drum sounds like, or the piano. Start with the biggest job first, the mix bus. The biggest job, once you set your balance. That's the biggest thing. Minor details can be put in later, but it's about the end result. The end result is the mix bus. That's the thing that gives you your final shape and your glue. So you got to start from there first. Okay, sequencing your EP. Well, this is something you can start to do from the time you do your pre-production, work tapes, storyboards. It might change once the record is finished. But as you make rough mixes and you progress things, just play with the sequence of the things that you're listening to, evaluating, get people's opinion. Just put a sequence on in the background and let it play. Just think about how it affected you. Change it. Experiment. Put it in iTunes or something. Put your songs in iTunes, so it's something that's easy to change the sequence of. SoundCloud, so you can share it with friends. Keep it private, or don't. Whatever you want to do. Sometimes I make. Sometimes I've taken index cards and I write the title of each song on an individual index card, and I can put them on a table with the artist, and we can talk about then it's easy to move things around, and you can sort of talk about it, and you can write the key of the song on there, the tempo. I mean, you don't necessarily want your 3 songs in the key of G to be back to back to back. Just lots of things to consider, and that's kind of an easy, nice way to do it, like in sort of an analog, way where you kind of get away from technology and it becomes kind of a conversation. Play around with it, spend the time. Mixing and completion checklist. Have you gone through all the 6-step mixing processes with all the songs in your EP? Are you starting with the middle of the pack song to build momentum for your mixing, to establish, to kind of get your template? Because once I start with the middle of the pack song, and I know what my mix bus is going to be in general, what my vocal treatment is going to be, what my maybe some of my processing for certain instrument groups is going to be, my parallel compression buses. Well, in Pro Tools, I can import those things from the first song I started into the second and third song, or I can create a template from it. It's like once you establish that base, then you can sort of use that work that you've already done as a jumping off point to kind of make the momentum, like to get momentum and a faster start on the next thing. Because if you've recorded your 5-song EP in a similar way, well, chances are the mix bus that you arrive on that first song you mix, it's going to work and translate as a good starting point on the other ones. Of course, you might need to make some adjustments on the EQ, the compressor not so much, the limiter not so much, but maybe the EQ. It's just you're kind of a step ahead. That's one of the reasons to start that way. Are you reaching the point where nothing in your mix calls for your attention? Maybe that's a time to take a break or let somebody else hear it. Just give it a rest. Don't work it to death. Have you sequenced your songs in your EP to the best way possible to hook listeners right from the start? We talked about this earlier on. Someone asked me a great question about is the pre-production phase or the recording phase too early to think about sequencing your song? Absolutely not. And sometimes even doing that work early on will help inform you about some of the choices you're making as you go along. It's like you begin to realize it's like, well, I think it's great to start with this song and then go into this one as number 2, but that one unusual instrument choice that I've made on a couple of these songs, I've put a zither on songs 1 and 2, and maybe that's not a good idea if it's only on these 2 songs. Maybe I shouldn't have which song is the zither more important on? Maybe it's more important on song 2, or maybe it's important on song 1. Well, then if the zither can be used somewhere else, great. If not, well, you just you learn things along the way like that. To recap our 4 phases, we've got the planning, the pre-production, recording, mixing, and completing your EP.